how to rebuild solidarity in a market society, and what are the challenges for integrated governance and political leaders. Bom dia a todos. Thank you for inviting me to this very interesting conference. I had no time to really dig into the materials you have prepared or the activities you have gone through the last 6 or 10 years. And my deep apologies for not speaking your language, Portuguese. I have a passive knowledge of Spanish, but I wouldn't dare to speak in Spanish unless I prepared for a couple of weeks, but that's not the idea. The capacity of my brain cells is too limited to learn more languages now. I also prefer to read my text because from experience I know that if I would start talking from my heart and my mind, you would miss lunch. The alternative would be that Rui would chase me from the stage, and even that is not an attractive alternative. So let's start. A conference on integrated governance, on cooperation as an essential social relation, a relation between groups of people, to achieve social-political transformation. What a relevant topic, but what a challenge. To come to sense about integrated governance, respecting most voices and human desires in society, is not an easy mission, even for people who are experienced specialists in the field or in different fields, like most of you are. The knowledge and forecasts about the future of our society, and especially the relationships between society, economy, and nature, are immensely complex. They mix pessimism and naive optimism about the power of the market to solve all problems. Yet, that same society, under threat of its natural economic and socio-political boundaries, is also fertile ground of new initiatives and experiments that formulate the basis of transformation. From my perspective today, I'm especially interested in initiatives and experiments in social innovation for governance. Yet, I want to build up my plea for what we coined as Bottomland governance in 3 steps with a small conclusion. In this talk, I want to address 3 topics. First, the relationship between society, economy, and nature. Pardon me for sound like the boring professor on this first point, but it will improve. In the second point, I want to address non-fake truths about the need for a renewed and new political life. And thirdly, I want to address what the political world and politics can learn from socially innovative governance in grassroots organizations, what we coined in our work, the rise of Bottomland governance. And in conclusion, some reflections on, I heard the word Superman and Superwoman listening in the background to the conversations in the first row of the auditorium. I want to talk about the new super political leader, the new homo politicus, and that's a provocation, of course. So first, the boring part, for some of you maybe, and I hope not. Society, economy, and nature. There are many ways to look at society and to analyze it. What a commonplace. Especially relevant today are approaches that examine the conditions under which, in the past, economy and society kept each other more or less together, disbalanced each other, and were led on new paths to find new equilibria, which then, with time, were again dislocated. The birth of this type of analysis is hard to date in history of thought and practice, in social science, in political science, and in history. But I guess that most relevant initial contributions that are helpful to understand what is going on in the contemporary relationship between society, economy, and nature should be situated from the 18th or 19th century onwards. Especially the 20th century provided us with several syntheses of societal development, addressing intersections between social relations, economy, the political world, the cultural worlds, and nature. For me today, a main reference is Karl Polanyi. Karl Polanyi's book, great book, The Great Transformation, the political and economic origins of our time. Not because Polanyi provides us with the ultimate recipe of how to reintegrate the social and the economic with each other, but because he explains clearly how an economy that throughout history till the 18th century was embedded in society, turned it into a so-called market economy that step by step became the dominant social relation between people and overruled many of the properly social-cultural bonds and ethics that were foundational to human society. By this, I'm not saying that what happened before an industrial revolution in Europe and in the world was a society that was respected by the economy. I'm just saying that the relationships were different and that society and politics had a lot more, and polity especially, had a lot more to say about the economy than today. Polanyi, already in the 1940s, and also based on his historical analysis, saw the perverse impact of an unleashed wildcat market economy on nature and the environment. Not only because of the commodification of society, the fact that everything had to be traded through the market or exchanged through the market, forcing humans to become economic actors only, but also because of the false truth, and false truth was not an invention of Trump, it has been in history all the time, also because of false truth liberal or neoliberal economists hold on to at the time and today. In summarized terms, what did we learn from Polanyi? We learned that when different elements of society, people, nature, culture, political life, are subjected to a market logic, then these elements lose their intrinsic role in the evolution of society. Polanyi used the term fictive commodities to refer to the way the marketization of society had reduced humans at work to labor or labor force, had reduced land as a terroir of nature and food provision to a marketable commodity and a means of speculation, and had reduced money as a means of exchange, savings, and credit to a monster of market speculation. No misunderstandings here. Polanyi, with one of the finest analyses of the history of markets in his mind, is not an opponent of markets, but he analyzes how highly deregulated price competition and individualism has, since the Industrial Revolution, destroyed the allocative function of local markets to provide appropriate use values like housing, like decent food, clothing, and so on. Or even more generally speaking, how blindly competitive markets undermined the existential roles of the economy, which was meant in its origin to gratify the needs of human beings and society. Polanyi believed that after the wild storm of liberalism of the end of the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, a new equilibrium between society and economy would be established, which came partly true under Fordism and Keynesianism, under the social welfare state, and so on, under the mixed economy. But this shaky equilibrium could only be materialized under the terms of international unequal exchange between so-called developed and developing economies, or as some called it, economic and political imperialism, and because of a high differentiation in social advantages of citizens and workers in so-called Fordist nations. In that sense, the term peripheral Fordism, which was launched by Alain Lippietz several decades ago, is a quite relevant concept. But Palani was too optimistic in his hope of re-establishing a balance between economy and society after the great economic crisis of the 1930s. New balances may have been reached in some, especially Western societies, but also novel imbalances were created. And if Palani had lived through the crisis of Fordism, he would have witnessed the return of liberalism in the sheepskin of neoliberalism with its promised global free trade, the revival of the liberal utopia that the free market can regulate itself and solve the financial, natural, and human disasters that ensued from this wildcat capitalism. If you leave it to the market, the credo is every problem will be solved in the end, or maybe humanity will be dissolved. That's a different perspective. But despite Polanyi's lack of a crystal ball to forecast what would happen after the re-regulation of the market under Keynesianism, his basic insight about the double movement in society, namely the economy seeking to dominate society and turn it into a market society, bumping in contradiction with a counter-movement of social protection and restoration of social bonds between human beings. Counter-movements are essential in the evolution and the revolution of society and its relationships to economy and nature. But can we still expect a true impact of such a counter-movement today? Conditions of society, economy, and political world have changed dramatically since Polanyi's time, but also since the golden 60s or the Trente Glorieuses, the heydays of the social welfare state in many Western European countries, if you like. Most alarming is probably the modification of personal and social ethics. Market exchange may have pacified the international world to a certain extent in the Western Hemisphere, but it has also caused new violence, new wars, and narrowed the fundamental ethics to those that are seen as inherent to market-conform behavior based on self-interest, individualism, private enrichment. Even the market unethical behavior of shirking and economic opportunism, though condemned in many economic theories, is increasingly tolerated in economic practice. Speculation is accepted as an economic practice. The behavior of bankers and traders in the upfront to the financial crisis of 2008 is hard evidence here. There exists a really enlightening literature on the development of ethics through history. Some older, like the majestic book by Kropotkin, some more recent writings explaining how religious ethics have bit by bit accommodated the economy's drive for profit and accumulation, even if this occurred at the expense of a growing or consolidated inequality and decreasing solidarity, environmental and climate decline, and so on. To translate this message into more systemic terms, it is especially the ideological system of a society and the way the state has defined its role in that ideological system that has determined the preference for or against social protection, as, for example, Piketty has explained in one of his recent books, in his most recent book, as a matter of fact. My second point, okay, don't worry. The second and third point are a bit more, are a bit shorter, and you will have the text. So the non-fake truth about a need for a renewed political. The political is broader than politics. The political is about the desire and the practice of citizens and groups to have a say and to have a real impact in governing society at all levels and in all forms, in a way. Palani showed the importance of state regulation in the relationship between economy and society. I'm a great consumer of water. Palani recognized the fractions in the state apparatus, defending or attacking diverse interests, causing painful fractures in society and in the economy, for example, between the social economy and the competition-driven global market economy. A similar vision of the state was held by some authors as the state as an arena of class struggle, or the concept of the mixed economy as used by many Keynesian and post-Keynesian economists. But is the state of the post-Keynesian era still a state? We expect a state to have some power. We expect a state to have some instruments to interfere in the economy and in society. What do we know about that Keynesian state? Still in a Palani mode of analysis, we used to identify in the 1960s and 70s, when I was still a student, 5 functions of state economic policy. I remember that time when I was told that economic policy had to be situated and applied as a policy bundle within a pentagon of economic policy with 5 vertices: a balanced labor market, economic growth, stable prices, a reasonable income distribution, to which was added later a reasonable wealth distribution, and finally, equilibrium in the balance of payments. I mean, this pentagon was referred to the so-called Jan Tinbergen School of Macroeconomic Policy, Jan Tinbergen being one of the first Nobel Prizes in economics. But when I read contemporary analysis of how this pentagon has reinvented itself, I'm confronted with the reduction of this geometric figure to a triangle with 3 vertices: flexible labor market, price competition in global market, and macroeconomic efficiency. Macroeconomics have basically disappeared, at least macroeconomics as I used to learn them as a student and as my professors taught me. Today, even the policy-making systems themselves have become subjugated to microeconomic efficiency and micro-accounting principles. Public management has overruled policy-making as a broader societal mission. Several departments of political science have now been turned in schools of public management, or departments of public management have taken over the leading role in departments of political science. Several state departments have been privatized or are run as private firms. And please do not understand me. Do not misunderstand me. Sorry, please understand me. Yeah. Do not misunderstand me. I am not making a plea to deliberate spending of public means, but for re-establishing a double movement, almost in the Palanian sense, between, on the one hand, economic good management of public means, and on the other hand, making resources available for reviving the political life, properly speaking, beyond the market for votes, beyond purely financial management of public funds. So what do we understand by the political? The political is essentially the social dynamics underlying the governance of a country, a region, a city, a neighborhood. Obviously, including disagreement, conflict, and power struggles, being capable of dealing with those, looking for agreements, but also looking for means of how to neutralize too powerful influences. The last 10, 15 years I've worked in spatial planning, and we always managed to design the most beautiful local development plans till the landowners came in sight. And then they said, no, this is impossible. We own that land. And that's where the problems start, of course. So the political is essentially the social dynamics underlying the governance of a country, a region, a city, I said. It involves what is usually called politics, as the actions of elected persons and their associates or representatives. But it's much broader than politics. It is equally so a space of contestation and agonistic engagement. The overall space of political engagement is increasingly dominated by politics, and I cite from Swingodo and Wilson, understood as technocratic mechanisms and consensual procedures that operate within an unquestioned framework of representative democracy, free market economics, and cosmopolitan liberalism. Could also be the definition of my university in a way, but I won't go into that. The domination. This domination involves more than market-affirming discourse. It's more than words, words, words. It also means an effective disarming of the state, removing some of its essential instruments in its roles as a custodian of the balance between the social and the economic. In most countries, I'm explaining what I mean by this, in most countries, state banks and mortgage companies are gone. They used to play a very important role in providing social housing, in providing accessible loans, and in preserving the savings of the modest citizen. Public enterprise and investment corporations belong to history in many countries. State roles are restricted to core state business, which is restricted to regulating markets. That sounds good, but according to the logic of the market. Today's state is poorly equipped to take on its roles. The state has sold out its furniture. In general, it is no longer allowed in its policy making to go against free market logic. Think about all the problems social economy enterprises have to find a place in the economy and not to be too antagonistic to the rulers of free trade and free competition. I mean, we hear witnesses of these struggles all over the world. So, not going against free market logic, it should go that state. Despite the fact that the market has had a devastating impact on society, political life, and nature. But market failures in this new credo of believing in the self-regulating power of the market, these market failures are considered as just sins. Sins, not even capital sins, but sins that can be washed away from the market's society's soul. To re-establish a sustainable relationship between society, economy, and nature, this credo and its practice needs a historical exegesis. Not only should the geometry of the state's role in economic policy be re-extended from a triangle to a pentagon, it also has to be reconfigured as an open public space, not following codified good governance, which in many ways is just respecting the rules of good corporate governance. And that's not what we need in political life. Giving voice to the people and letting their voices have a real impact on the working of the political system and the policy priorities is a complex issue in a complex society. But complexity can never be an argument in favor of surrendering to the utopian simplicity of market allocation. Instead, it should be a trigger to revise societal democracy and the place of economic governance within that democracy. So I come to my third point, the rise of Bottomland governance. Here I shortened my text a little bit, but you will have the text, and there are readings in the end that are based on concrete cases in Spain, in the US, in Latin America. Political discontent is all over. We should not fool ourselves. Political discontent is all over society, and it takes on many forms. There are many triggers of discontent. It has several sources. Old and new media document uprising, mobilization at street level, self-help initiatives in response to both state and market failure. But discontent is not only the sake of organized or spontaneous movements. Numerous are the critiques and sometimes more and sometimes more aggressive reactions to the so-called common citizens. The mistrust and increasingly also disgust of politics are growing. We should not fool ourselves. So many people of diverse background have lost their faith in politics, and for diverse reasons. But others think of new ways to improve democracy and give the political a new life, capacitate it again to address the real problems of society. It is the experience, feeling, or impression that politicians are no longer capable of solving new or even old problems. First on the list is security, in Western Europe at least. Other countries, it could be poverty, housing, and so. Security. Although the news about growing domestic insecurity is mostly fake truth. I mean, statistics on crime of different kinds show that violence is decreasing in most of the countries in the Western world. Migration, as if war victims should not find a temporary new home. I refer to my own countries, where during the First World War there were 1 million refugees fleeing the German armies and going to the Netherlands. Were they treated well? Can be criticized, but at least they were treated much, much better than Syrian refugees today are treated in Europe as a whole. Poverty versus explicit, not to say obscene wealth. I'm such a simple mind that I do not understand what people do with a net income of more than 10,000 euro a month, and I'm very generous still. But if you would reinvest all above that into, let's say, social economy, and we won't discuss the terms of this now, the world would look very, very different. Noise, water and air pollution, new industrial complexes in agriculture and mining, monopolizing water and land. Chilean state returning land and water rights to local communities, but then local communities sell these rights, use rights to big mining companies, not out of free will, but because they are put under pressure, to put it very simply. So people are caught in the treadmill of a commodified labor market. They are stripped of their non-economic time, and when they are free, they are deprived of an enjoyable natural environment that has unfortunately been disrobed of many of its goodies, of its attractive features. Of course, new forms of modification, well, codification is part of it, of course, new forms of commodification of social relations and life experiences, like, for example, generalized consumerism, stir reactions among people. These reactions range from resignation to isolation in the family, cocooning, doing your own small thing, to extreme forms of compensation. But all people also fall in the trap of contemporary populism that by use of the new media whips up and forges facts into dramatic and indignant misleading messages, affecting voting behavior to the extent that political decision-making often misses fact-checking empirical grounds, as we say, and leads to the wrong or ambiguous political decisions. It is partly in reaction against the paralysis of the political because of contemporary politics, but especially because of their belief in change potential, that grassroots movements, citizens' initiatives, socially innovative initiatives have risen. The variety of such initiatives is very high, but most of them address very important economic, social, culture, and environmental issues. There is a mushrooming of these movements all over the world. In many cities and regions and countries, atlases of what we could call socially innovative initiatives are provided. And you become very optimistic when you see this. You also see the lack of political power stemming from these movements, but still. Most of you, most of us, know several of such initiatives. You are part of them, and you lead them, and you understand very well why they have risen. From my own experience in action research, I can refer to the neighborhoods associations in cities across the world, short chain sustainable food growing and distribution initiative like community-supported agriculture, so-called law shops where people can receive legal advice respect to their housing rights, their income rights, and so on, housing associations and their networks, environmental movements, mutual aid in work, education, and health and mental health services. Various types of such initiatives we analyzed under the flag of social innovation as a combination of satisfaction of human needs, the rebuilding of social relations, of association and solidarity, together with empowerment towards socio-political transformation. I know the term social innovation has an ambiguous meaning today. But I started using the term back in the 1980s, before neoliberalism made use of it. So there is copyright, and there is a clear and social political vision behind it. We, the networks I have coordinated together with colleagues and friends, we launched the term social innovation in reaction to the exclusively technological and economic reading of innovation. One of the big lessons we learned from our social innovation action research is that socially innovative initiatives and social movements are great learning grounds for more democratic governance. Our work even led us to the replacement of the term bottom-up governance by bottom-linked governance. What do we understand by bottom-linked governance? I skipped the part where I expressed some criticism towards bottom-up, but you can read that. What do we understand by bottom-linked governance? It's new forms of cooperation between actors and institutions across territorial scales in which policy, broadly defined, and other development practice are not dictated from any one level of governance, but transformed and institutionalized through interaction and cooperation itself. The concept is important as a complement or even an alternative to bottom-up governance, which as an ideal has a number of politically ineffective features. And sorry, I skipped this. The cautious attitude towards bottom-up only does not mean that grassroots movements do not count. Quite the contrary. In fact, the modes by which socially innovative initiatives, organizations, and movements govern are very important learning experiences for multi-level, multi-scale democratic governance. Joint learning experiences between socially innovative experiences, local government agencies, local politicians, community leaders have been proved to be essential in building bottom-linked governance. Local government, especially local government, learns from what is going on as modes of governance in social movements, in grassroots initiatives, and vice versa, I mean, sometimes grassroots movements are too naive, too utopian in dealing with some issues, and they have to negotiate with the pragmatism that many actors within local development agencies have, for example. The modes of operation of bottom-line governance can be inspiring for addressing the challenges arising from multiscalarity, inter-urban and inter-regional cooperation. We have empirically studied and theorized these bottom-line governance dynamics through the lenses of community support agriculture initiatives, neighborhood development organizations, and networks. Revolts against gentrification projects resulting into community mobilization and local development strategies led by civil society. A very important case study was the trajectories in Barcelona, for example, the social movements and social political mobilization trajectories in Barcelona. There is for sure your own experience, which should be one of your main guides, but I still invite you to have a look at how the European networks I coordinated have understood the role of bottom-line governance and the roles and attitudes individuals and groups have taken on in such experiences. In conclusion, which homo politicus do we need in bottom-line governance? I'm not following Plato by the book, obviously, but I use the term he was using. I'm finishing this talk with some reflections on how a homo politicus, a good-willing homo politicus today could and should act in a bottom-line governance mode. Also with the ambition of mining some of the citizens' negative reactions against politics and its protagonists. Some of the anti-political attitudes have indeed become quite personal towards politicians and political leaders. Politicians are wealthy, entrepreneurs and bankers are greedy. Politicians, like wealthy entrepreneurs and bankers, are greedy. They pursue their own financial interests. So I hear all the time when I move in my wider family, in wider communities, and I live in a relatively progressive environment. So they think they know better than generally accepted scientific knowledge, especially with respect to climate change. You hear people say, why don't I follow the advice of the scientists? Why do they quarrel about, why don't they combine 5 or 6 main recipes, which are very clearly documented and the impact shown? They don't listen to common people or have lost their common sense. My wife says that politicians have lost their common sense. Not all of them, but many of them. They believe that the economy can solve all problems. The market regulates itself. They are, and to a certain extent, many are poisoned by market logic and credo. And then, politicians lack respect of common people and feel too easily threatened by strong reactions from citizens. Politicians act as if they are not political beings, but actors in the market for votes. They just go for the votes, they make promises, then they realize some of the promises, but far from sufficient. Many of these perceptions are true for several politicians, but I trust and I know many politicians with a high level of self-criticism and who act responsibly in their role. So I'm closing this talk by briefly reflecting on which features of political leadership best fit the bottom-line governance dynamics, which has now found a kind of consensus in many cities around the world. Looking at a summary of features of bottom-line governance, as in the table which you cannot see, but I will read you some, we can shed light on some desirable features. So features of bottom-line governance, very rapidly. Bottom-line governance should be inclusive. It should also include the voices of silent minorities. Leaders should work towards inclusion of voices of different style. They should develop empathetic leadership. Community initiatives are the crux of rebuilding a social fabric. Community initiatives, social movements breaking through uneven power relations, building coalitions between political agents and social agents can be very important in rebuilding the social fabric. Rationalities that should be conciliated in Bottomland governance go beyond the rationality of market and competition. Look and take into account irrational commons, so-called irrational commons, which sometimes contain very important criticisms of the way a local system works. Take into account the psychological complexity of human beings. Negotiate between different values and desires, because a municipality, a neighborhood, consists of various communities, important individuals, leading individuals, defending different values, which in reality can often be conciliated with each other. And replace the so-called accountability, as we find it, for example, in the good governance model, by dialogical justification. Dialogical justification takes time, but still. So if we project these features of Bottomland governance on the role of leadership in politics, politicians and good leadership for collective learning processes, we can privilege the following features. Several of them also match with you would refer to as the Ubuntu philosophy and practice. Combining managerial with communicative and associative capacities. Being able to share leadership. Not one guru, not one charismatic person, but a passionate group, owning and sharing different skills, replacing each other in terms of good health. How would I say? If people have occasional health problems, be ready to jump in, to take over some roles, and so on. Being able to deal with multivocality and diversity, from outcries of the Sardines in Italy today, or the Gilets jaunes in France, but also the weak voice of isolated elderly in a run-down urban neighborhood. People who never leave their house also have an opinion of how a neighborhood should be run, how housing should be taken care of, how care should be taken care of, and so on. Build up immunity to inequality reinforcing power games. I mean, don't get intimidated by landowners. Start negotiating with them. And if need there is, mobilize against exaggerations of private land ownership and the way private landowners want to use the land. Political leadership is not meant to serve economic interests first, although we know that economic interests are diverse. Know the social fabric where the collective learning unrolls. Politicians should be streetwise. They should move around in the streets, they should talk to the people, and so on. In typical, And then finally, and I strongly believe in this, psychoanalysis to eradicate any form of paranoia and be strong enough to place radical and even insultive voices in the right context. Insults are sometimes very important sources of frustration, outcries, as Rancière would say. We have to be cool enough to listen to these voices and put them in the right context. I mean, our ego may be hurt, or we may be over-fatigued or overstressed, and so on. So we should, possibly with the help of psychoanalysis, strengthen our mind to deal with this kind of contradictions, if not aggression. Radical voices often hold a lot of truth, and it is important to take them seriously and collaborate with protagonists of just social demands. This will be essential if we want to move away from market society to a sustainable society. Thank you for your attention.